Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology.
Hello, everybody. Today, on the very first episode that we are actually dubbing The Story of Us, we have some very special guests, and I would like to give the floor to them so they may introduce themselves.
So hello, I'm Ryan. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Adelaide. I'm doing my PhD in the anatomy, discipline of anatomy. My work is focused on reconstructing hominids. So this is the soft tissue reconstruction, not so much the reconstruction of the bone. And I've been doing that for the last 3 years. So we've had 2 publications, and work has been accepted. So things are going well. And we're just really looking forward to sort of sharing our work with your viewers of the world of paleoanthropology.
Definitely.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Gabriel Viñas. I'm a third year and recent, or at least I'm about to receive, since I just finished my thesis defense, an MFA in sculpture at the Arizona State University. And so I've been Ryan's collaborator now for about going on 7 years, maybe 8 now.
Oh, wow.
Who's counting? Even though we've never formally met since he's on the other side of the world. But it's been a very fruitful and delightful partnership where I get to, do what I think, I bring to the table, which is the sculptural part of it. And then he brings the scientific know-how. And then it's just been an education with not just Ryan, but also our mentor, Machi Henneberg, who's basically given me a little subtle degree in itself of education into the world of science. So it's all exciting work.
Well, that is oh, of course. That sounds amazing from both of you, and I'm so excited to have you guys on the show and to talk about this, because it's not something most people think of when they think of anthropology. They don't. I mean, there's definitely that kind of crime show-esque thing I'm sure a lot of people will think of when reconstructing faces and things like that, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about something, I mean, I know the elements are probably similar, but we're talking about reconstructing creatures we've never seen before. We don't know what they look like. And honestly, unless we have a time machine, probably never will. So how do you reconstruct something that in your mind technically does not exist?
So I'm really happy that you've come sort of straight to that question, because it is, for me, the hardest question to answer. And I guess all I can say is that we follow the traditions of biological anthropology and using comparative anatomy to make inferences about the past, using observations made of, natural phenomena occurring today. So I guess, to sort of, all right, a really simple one. If we have a skull and, half of it is missing, half of the skull is missing, how do we know that the other half existed? It seems like an obvious question, and it kind of is, which is why I'm using it as this example. We know that animals have bilateral symmetry, so therefore we can infer that, of course, this animal very likely had another side to the face. So then you take that one step further and you go, well, did it have muscles? And again, it's kind of an obvious question. Yes, it did have muscles. What me and Gabriel try to do is take it that one step further. So yes, it had muscles. Yes, it had an epithelium. Yes, it had pelage. It had a fur coat. But can we know with a higher degree of precision the soft tissues that covered, the volumes of those soft tissues? That's what we are working on. And the reason we're working on that is, I guess it was triggered by what I saw in the Creation Museum. I saw a reconstruction of Lucy in the Creation Museum. And this reconstruction of Lucy was depicted as a quadruped, was walking on all fours, has as a knuckle walker like a chimpanzee, and then they presented an argument, against forensic facial approximation, saying, oh look, we don't really know. Here are these series of faces, and it could be anything. So then it got me thinking, well, how has no one really addressed this? No one has we have no comeback to this. There has to be sort of a strong pushback against this sort of misinformation. So that led to us, asking the questions, starting at the very beginning, what do we know? How reasonable is it to depict Lucy with very low concentrations of melanin in her skin, even though she was from Africa? So I guess that's another example, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. Objective, empirical ways of approximating the soft tissues of Pio-Pleistocene hominids. That's what we are interested in doing. And it's an extremely hard task. So back to your question, how do we know that how do we verify it? So, the reason why what you've said is so integral is because for something to be scientific, it has to be falsifiable. So we have to be able to say, it has to be tested, it has to be questioned. So therefore, luckily for us, there are lots of primates on the planet. There's us, Homo sapiens. There's also the chimpanzee. There's two chimpanzees. You've got the pan-troglodytes, common chimpanzee, Pampaniscus, the bonobo, the smaller chimpanzee, gorilla. You have South African apes. Then you've gone into the orangutan. Using these as models for the work we do is the best that we can do. That is simply the best that we can do. So if we say Australopithecus africanus had large jaws, or let's take an even more extreme example, Paranthropus boisei, very large zygomatic arches, sagittal crest, huge jaw. It had large muscles of mastication, so the temporalis and the masseter. Okay, fine, large. It's not nearly as descriptive as we would like it to be. What do you mean? What is large? This can be intuited differently by different people. So I guess I don't want to go into it too much now because it'll come up later on, but we have found ways using, again, observations that we make from, living apes, living apes, using those observations and then interpolating those observations into the fossils. So if you wanted to reconstruct a woolly mammoth, you wouldn't choose a horse or a Tasmanian devil. You would pick another elephant. You would pick something with a similar morphology, a closer relationship phylogenetically than the zebra or whatever. Same thing would be if you wanted to reconstruct the woolly rhinoceros. You would pick something that has a very close anatomically, and then you interpolate that data or those observations into the fossils. So in our case, we have the great apes and we have ourselves. And so far, it's given us a lot of good results. We've been able to make a lot of observations that people have not made before about the relationships between the bone and the overlying soft tissues. And then we've been able to produce methods that are totally repeatable, that anyone can now take the fossil, make those measurements, and then produce the same image as it stands today. Incomplete as it may be, it's still an objective approximation of the soft tissues. So that's my answer to your question about how do we verify it. Yeah.
Wow, and that's just that whole process just sounds, I have almost zero artistic ability to begin with, so even being able to think how to create something like that is just beyond my understanding. But physically and biologically, it makes sense when people think about, of course, we're talking about ancestors that we believe to be our ancestors, so of course they're going to look like we think we would look like, or our relatives. Now, when you are trying to create something like this, what is the first thing that you do?
Gabriel, do you want to take the floor?
Well, we actually started to outline the set of phases that we go through, and maybe Ryan could take us through those in a moment. But the very first thing we would do is first identify whether or not the specimen in question is suitable, which means is there enough bone by which we could actually measure? Because the publication that we've gone ahead and published in PLOS ONE is about the relationship between the bony tissues, the hard tissues, and the soft tissues that overlie it. And think of the soft tissues as the amount of clay that I'm going to put on. So if we can't run our regression model, which are the set of equations that produce.
I think we're having a technical glitch here. Should we just?
A little bit.
I have no idea what happened there. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
My apologies.
But we cannot see you. Oh, it is okay. I'll just.
That's right. I'll take the floor. I mean, so yeah, Gabriel is right. You have to have, you know, the foundations are the bones. If you don't have the bones, then there's very little that you can do. So one of the sort of traps that we fell into at the beginning was reconstructing hominids that were, you know, quote unquote, the popular ones to reconstruct. So for example, Lucy. You know, let's do a facial reconstruction of Lucy. Lucy is actually the worst candidate for a facial reconstruction because there's too much subjectivity going into reconstructing the bone of Lucy, of the skull of Lucy, her cranium. That causes a downstream effect whereby now you're producing a reconstruction based on a reconstruction, which is not what we want. So for what me and Gabriel are doing, it absolutely does limit the number of specimens that we can perform a facial approximation on. With that said, there are still, like, every single one of these can be, is the subject of a facial approximation, and we're very likely to discover, you know, further fossil evidence. Plus, the regression models that, you know, regression equation, this idea of reconstruction, it's totally what's the word? Like, it has extendability to reconstructing bone itself. So that's the very first thing we do. We look at the fossil evidence, and then we decide, is there enough material here? You know, some are very easy. The tongue child is a great candidate. It's just so well preserved. Homo naledi is very well preserved. Sediba paranthropus is obviously very well. The OH5 specimen is very well preserved. The ones that are not, again, Lucy, very, very poorly preserved. And then, you know, you have reconstructions. There's the Kimball skull, the Australopithecus afarensis Kimball skull. And it consists of many individuals. I won't say the exact number here because I don't want to get it wrong. But for us, it's kind of like, you know, yeah, we could perform a reconstruction on that, but there are these other better preserved fossils that are more suitable. So let's do them first, and then we'll get to the ones that are least suited. So that's the very first step we take, is deciding what fossil is appropriate for the reconstruction procedure.
And I mean, that definitely sounds like a very important first step. And just going back a little, I just want to mention, speaking of Lucy, first of all, I think where you are, Ryan, it is actually the anniversary of the discovery of Lucy. Yeah. Speaking of which, and then, so whenever you see Lucy's skull in a museum or everywhere, that is not Lucy's skull. Lucy's skull was found in tons of pieces. Yeah, and what we see,
it's a mandible. And look, I'm not trying to come down too hard on these reconstructions at all, like these models that exist. But I do think people need to be aware. People need to be aware that what you're looking at may or may not be, you know, exactly how it was meant to be. And I kind of feel like that information is mostly missing. And it's certainly when someone goes into a museum display or some other, you know, educational institute, I think we owe it to the public to present things as transparently as possible. So yeah, Lucy is a tricky
and that goes. It ties in well on what you say about like what are the steps, right? Initially, yeah, the first steps is okay. You identify the thing, and then you say, okay, that this specimen, like this is OH5, had muscles, right? And then generally, what's been done is that okay, you put the muscles in their known anatomical positions, insertion and order, and then you make these inferences, and you construct what appears to be a fully complete model, and then that visual imagery primes the viewer, especially when they see the muscles, and it looks very technical, to be like, oh, scientific, or oh, I saw that on CSI, or I saw that on some forensic channel. Therefore, science. The same thing where you go into a museum of natural history, and it's not that people are out to bamboozle the public. That's not the case. Like they are trying to get people very excited about science, and sometimes the best way to do that is to have something that you can relate to. So since Lucy is very famous, one, you have to give her a skull. Someone has to reconstruct that skull. Seldom is there a paper that goes along with that reconstruction, but they're trying to get the public to at least identify with something. And then the further step is to reconstruct musculature and a full face on top of that. Let's just call it estimation at best skull. You know what I mean? So what we want to do is to make sure that from the very beginning, we identify not just a specimen that's primed for doing this anatomical reconstruction, but also looking to primates that exist today, ourselves and our fellow apes included, to make sure that not only do we put the muscles where they go, but just how much, like where do we stop? Do we stop here or do we stop here? Sometimes we're surprised that the regression model tells us this over here is actually way out here. And when you look at a dissected chimpanzee, there is this area here that we've come to call CDL, which is like right in front of the condyle here, lateral to the condyle, where it's like this auditory area where it's just more bulged than we have. But it's clear that primates have some sort of slight physiological difference that our equations seem to have captured. So it wouldn't surprise me if, you look at other reconstructions in the past, and then maybe they made this very human-like, where it kind of comes in, but he might actually come way out, kind of like the Tong child here. You see how the lateral sides of his head come out just slightly more. And it's very different than the first reconstructions of the Tong child that Ryan and I have done. This is the fifth one, where it's taken these many iterations, and we strive to make it so that it's transparent, that these are models, not just in the physical sense, but in the scientific sense, that they're always subject to revision. And that kind of transparency, I think what Ryan was alluding to, is that it seems to be lacking in museum displays. Maybe because people don't want, maybe the museum has different motivations, or they're trying to be careful. They don't want to push away an already skeptical public here in the United States, where they're very transparent. And you're like, hey, there's a lot we don't know. People will be like, oh, this is all nonsense. I'm going to go back to whatever it is that I believed in. So it's complicated, but I think Ryan and I tend to try to err on the transparency and being excited about what we know, but then being very transparent about what we don't.
And I think that's very important and key to science in general, and especially open access science, where you are dealing with the public. Being able to communicate and have things available for them, I think, is key. And I'd at this time like to just throw out there that your website, which, correct me if I'm wrong, pithecus.org, is stunning. It looks amazing, and it's very informative, and I encourage everyone to go there to see what you guys are up to and what you're working on. And I just wanted to, so when you have when you're working on a reconstruction and you have here's an example. Okay, so at least as far as I understand it, we do not know exactly, we have an idea, but we don't know exactly when we lost our hair, our body hair. Now we still have it, everyone, but it's much shorter, much thinner, much less dense than a chimp. How do you figure that in to your reconstructions and knowing when and what has what?
Yeah, so what I would say is, I guess first of all, Gabriel and I, at this present time, we do not have a like definitive version from start to finish of this is every step that you need to take to reconstruct Lucy or reconstruct any hominid. That's the first thing. We attempted to do that at the very beginning of my PhD. We were trying to achieve too much, way too much. Every single step requires tons of work, tons of analysis, tons of statistics. And I guess I say that to say, like what I'm about to say about hair is a long way off. It's a long way off. But all I was going to say was that there are papers that have looked at melanin concentrations, and people who have more melanin concentrations on a square centimeter of skin tend to have a lower follicle density. So it appears like the melanin competes for surface area on the epithelium. So therefore, more melanin, less hairy, less melanin, more hairy. So again, like I said, that's a way off to what we want to achieve. But I guess it links back to what Gabriel and Gabriel said before. The fact that we don't know that, and the fact that what we've been able to demonstrate so far is like the playing field is open. Anyone can now like grab hold of that and try to produce something. Something is better than nothing. And at the moment, really, what I just said to you is pretty much all we've got. It's like a hunch. It's just intuitively, there's a little bit of science, but mostly it's kind of just an assumption. And I kind of feel like we need to get away from that. Me and Gabriel, at least certainly in our publications, we only present what we know. So I guess this would be a good opportunity to tell the story about +1 on the major review of that publication during the peer review. We had a figure at the end of the paper, and it had a reconstruction of a bonobo and a chimpanzee and Mrs. Pless. And one of the criticisms was that, you've reconstructed Mrs. Pless with a nose, ears, wrinkles, whatnot, but your paper says nothing about these features. And they were absolutely right. They were absolutely right. That figure should not have included those. Yeah, so Gabriel is showing it here. That figure should not have included those features that were not based on that paper. So we actually, instead of presenting this beautifully sculpted piece of art, which Gabriel had worked on, obviously going into the details, which requires an extraordinary technical ability, we took that all away to present only what we can objectively show. And I'm so glad we did that, because now what we've shown is just the facts. We're not trying to exaggerate what we've accomplished. So yeah, you raise a good point about the hair, and that extends to bodies, nose, nasal anatomy, ears, the eyeball diameter, lip thickness. All of this stuff, which has been explored in the forensic facial approximation literature, all of this stuff is just waiting to be touched on by anyone who wants to, take what Gabriel and I are doing as seriously as we do.
And I think that's the true essence of science. You're making way, and you're making your discoveries transparent, as you've said. And you're putting it out there so other people can use it, benefit from it, and learn and make progress. And as we all know, that's what science is. It's progress, or it's not science. So what is different from what you guys do today with your reconstructions, however far you get with them, compared to previous reconstructions?
Okay,
is it just how much is interpreted? Or...
Well, this is really good, because what Gabriel and I did was we had a feeling that people would accept our, I'm going to say the word, criticisms of the practice if we tried to replicate what others had done in the past. So we spent the good part of 4 years, was it 4 years, Gabriel, trying to just basically taking the methods that people had used and then doing them ourselves.
And I think that actually, remember when you mentioned these hunches, that at the moment we have a hunch. And then usually when some of these practitioners are interviewed, they'll talk about this hunch, and then they'll hand wave a little bit, and then that'll justify their artistic choice. Where, like, again, to use OH5, you have the sagittal crest, and you have the big masturbatory apparatus. It justifies large muscles. So then when the artist puts on these large muscles, it's almost like that's it. There's no question, there's no challenge, but then there's also no paper, there's no statistical analysis, there's no cross-referencing between what is observed in biological reality. And it just goes to show, like, we've just recently, there's a preprint of this new study that we're vying for publication, that we spent all sorts of, like Ryan, all sorts of measurements. I created all sorts of little models of noses where we spent basically 30 pages of reading, and all it really justifies is the position of the tip of the nose in relationship to the skull. So we basically have, like, it's a point that comes out here and it tells us the tip of the nose stops there. It doesn't tell us what the shape of the nose is quite yet. And that might come, but it takes that amount. It takes that amount of, I guess, commitment of maybe like a very niche interest, which is probably why it's taken so long. I mean, if you think about it, it's a very young science.
It is.
And so, and it's interesting that what that does is it kind of corrects things from the past, where Boise eye, because it's such a flat face, has constantly been portrayed by other practitioners as very flat nosed. And sometimes even the nose is kind of inside and the cheeks protrude beyond his or her nose, depending on how they reconstruct it, right? But what we found is with our method, when we apply to OH5, the nose actually does come out quite a bit. It's not a full projecting nose. It's still fairly flat, but the equations have sussed out what we've observed in all the apes we've measured, that pronasal is usually the furthest point out in the nasal area. And it's no different for someone with such a caved in face, which was kind of interesting, where it kind of basically says, like, these are the empirical markers that further corrects these, what I would call maybe generously hypothesis from other practitioners. But it's just going to take that level of studying for every aspect. And I think that's what sets us apart.
Yeah, I will just add, like, the question of like what people did in the past, it was either intuition or it was a hodgepodge of a little bit of intuition and then a little science, which was like, I'm going to measure 2 or 3 apes, not disclose how those measurements were taken, and then come to a conclusion and present that. And that's really it. And that's totally fine if you're just trying to produce an artistic interpretation. And right. People can carry on doing that. That's totally fine. What me and Gabriel are doing, and what we have done, is produce methods that have interspecies compatibility. And that's the key. The key is interspecies compatibility. If we can produce a method that can be used on gorillas, subadult gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans, then again, the question still remains, how do we know that it works on Lucy? But at that point, it's kind of beyond reasonable doubt. If it works on all these species and it works extremely accurately within 1 or 2 millimeters of error, then it's just, it's beyond reasonable doubt. If anyone disagrees, it's okay, fine, sure. Tell me why it would be different. I guess that would be the key. If they say, oh no, the nose would not be like that, well, why would it not be like that? I guess that can't be that can't just be accepted. That's a test of our hypothesis, and it has to be so it sort of has to follow the protocols that we have taken. So I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Gabriel.
I actually think that just for maybe people that probably the majority of our audience here, it probably hasn't read the +1 paper, right? And then how we know that it works on these other species is because we use CT scans, right? And these are how we derive the regression models, and they're made using a certain sample, right? And then we use those equations on the hard tissues of out of group members. So another chimpanzee, if we did it on chimpanzees, a gorilla, a siamang, a bonobo, all these other individuals in orangutan, and then we check if the equation predicts the soft tissues that we can observe. And we know that since they're out of group, that the equations weren't made with them in mind. It means that the equations are kind of running blind. So when we see a hit where it says like, oh, not only did it predict a chimp and a bonobo, which we would expect because we use humans and chimps for these, for the ones that we're talking right now, the nose, but we were also further surprised that it works on gorillas, which we're talking about a bigger branch in the evolutionary tree. That means that these equations are capturing something about the morphology of primates, at least our general size of primate. Because I think we saw the Siamang, the accuracy decreases, but you're talking about a completely different biological design, for lack of a better word. Not that design is a problematic term, but you get the picture here, where it's just a different morphological niche, perhaps. So our equations, we're not dismayed that they didn't work for Siamangs. We're not trying to, achieve Hawking's unified theory of of science here to unify all. It's just like we're trying to figure out this size of primate that we belong to. And it was super surprising. That was like, even if it didn't work for gorillas, we'd be like, oh, at least it works for us, chimps and bonobos, which is close enough. But the fact that it did work on gorillas, it emboldens us to say that, yes, it very likely does say something about, say, Mrs. Pless or OH5 or Homo erectus for sure. That it just removes a lot of guesswork, which I think sometimes, it's not that I feel conflicted, but every time I talk about it, especially with artists, where it's like, what it's doing is it's limiting my degrees of freedom. But I used to say it in that way. I used to say it in that kind of language. But now what I think of it is that what Ryan and I are doing, it's not that it's limiting our freedom, but it's like a tool that hones my focus. Where if you think about a tool, what a tool does is it limits my hand's ability to mess up something delicate. When I use a small little dental tool to make a wrinkle, I'm limiting my finger's capacity to ruin it. So when we're using these equations, what we're doing is limiting our human error to let these assumptions drive us to extremes on either side. Where when a peg that is, maybe if we had one here that comes out maybe 6 or 7 millimeters, when it says that is the prediction, it tells me, put the clay to that. Now, there are spaces between points where I have to use my comparative anatomy skills and my sculpting ability to bridge those gaps. But the moment we continue to add points and papers, the head would be riddled with points for me to kind of aim at, and to really make this more a democratic process, where anyone, even if they don't have all the sculpting chops in the world, if they have so many points to aim at and they know where to stop the clay at the very least, that image you saw a second ago of Miss Pless, where everything was kind of taken away, anyone could get to that point. And I think that that's such a great democratization of science, where in the spirit of open science, what we want is for more people to be able to do this. I take no pleasure in saying like, oh yeah, I'm pretty good at sculpting and therefore you need me. Like, no, I take more pride in the fact that what Ryan and I are doing allow other people that, even if they don't have an art degree or any practice sculpting, they can at least get so far and at least make these observations that they can show their students. Sure. Or instead of saying like, oh, Boise, I had a huge mascatory apparatus. No, show your student exactly how big these, it was. It's very different to see just the bone, but to see some anatomy overlying it. So I think what we're doing, it's further kind of unique in that sense. But what we're trying to do is not obfuscate and let like, oh, the genius of the artist and the scientist be in the background. We're like, oh, this is what we're showing you. It's just like, no, we're giving you the tools so that you can do it too.
And I think that is amazing. And again, the key to moving science forward is providing those tools based on your own work and putting in that hard work and sweat and tears and everything, and letting other people benefit from it. Now, going back a little bit, you mentioned points, and I know a lot of people are not going to know exactly what you're talking about. So can you explain sort of how it's used in anatomy to depict, depth of muscle, etc.?
Yeah, so they're cephalometric landmarks, very, very, very commonly used, not only in anthropometry, so measurements of anthropoids basically, but every single one has a location. So if you bring up the +1 paper, there'll be a table, and then so here we go. So in the +1 paper, there'll be a table with the definitions of all the landmarks, and then in the figure, it basically shows you where every single one of those landmarks is. Some of them are really easy to locate, like along the midline, like nasion, for example, along the midline where the nasal bones, the frontal bones meet the nasal bones. Others are a little more tricky. They're like, the middle distance between two other landmarks. So you sort of have to know to place those first. But those are those landmarks. And the ones that we like, as far as I know, and of course I've done a literature review on this topic. This is easily the most comprehensive, array of landmarks that have ever been taken from a chimpanzee skull. It's only one other study that has taken measurements from a chimpanzee skull, and it was very, very limited. Whereas what we've done is huge, not only for chimps, but if we extrapolate this to modern humans, you see, because in modern human forensic facial reconstruction, you're really only interested in the face. You're not interested in the rest of the head. But with Australopithecus, we need to do the whole thing. So we took measurements from places that other people just have never taken measurements from. So yeah, look, if anyone wants to put those landmarks on a skull, they can do so using that table and the figure with the illustration. And then not only that, but that table also provides the planes of measurement. So for example, if you've got Nasion, let's go back to Nasion. How do you know it's not up here or down here or forward? So what we do is we position the skull in what's called the Frankfurt horizontal, which is like a standard position of the skull. And then from that, we use the planes. So the horizontal plane, sagittal plane, and that dictates sort of where the measurement is taken, because that's extremely important when we're doing a correlation analysis, which is what we did. We're trying to correlate soft tissue to bone. It's extremely important that the measurements are taken in exactly the same way between samples, because obviously you need more than one chimp. So yeah, like it's all there. You can really just take that table, find the cephalometric landmarks. They're very difficult to remember. It's taken me, and even I still forget them. Unless you're placing them every single day, you do forget them. Which is why those obviously these, I've got a few here. These reference charts are so useful. Even while I was measuring these chimpanzees, which took me about 3 months to do, and the reason for that is because you've got to take a measurement twice. The reason why you've got to take the measurement twice is because you have to report your technical error of measurement. So you have to show that your measurements are repeatable. So I 3D printed a model of a chimpanzee with all the points on it in the directions that I needed to take them. And I used that as reference for those 3 months. And yeah, so it's very labor intensive to do that. It does take a long time, and it's very tedious, but you really just get some nice music on and just sort of zone out, or listen to a podcast and just sort of live in it for 3 months. But yeah, the soft tissues the overlying integument is the most time consuming part. The other details, like the eyeball within the diameter of the orbit, or the mouth width, they're much easier to collect because there's fewer measurements to take. But yeah, that's what those landmarks are.
Perfect. Okay, and that hopefully makes sense to everyone. Of course, we can go into that later if that doesn't. Now, when you're continuing on, so you say what is the farthest a construction has gone for you guys? What is that has been the most successful you feel?
Okay, I'll show you. So really, this model, and it might be underwhelming to a lot of people, but this is it. That's STS5, so that's Mrs. Pless.
Yeah, that was that image you saw a second ago that went forward and backward, forward and backward. Mm-hmm. That's the backward, where that's just the features are blurred away. I did a scan, and that's the 3D print of that scan. So that's also scaled down, of course. It should be.
Now, I will stress that the interspecies compatibility. So for this particular, the publication that this is featured in, we produced equations, which is very, very simple. It sounds complicated. It's really not. You take measurements of the bone. So, for example, this distance here, zygion to zygion, just that width. And then you take a measurements of the soft tissue. So let's say glabella. And you try to see if, when this point increases in width, if this also increases in width. Then you run a regression analysis. If it works out, basically you get a correlation coefficient. If that's 1, it means it's very strong. You never get a correlation of 1. But if you still get a statistically significant correlation, from that regression, you can produce an equation. So And then from there, it's like, all right, well, let's test it. Let's see if it works on chimpanzees. So the same species that was used to produce the equations themselves. So you test it on chimps, and what we found is, of course, it works. But then it's like, how far will it go? So we tried it on a bonobo, and of course it worked.
This
The
one
bonobo,
here.
yeah, and that's the bonobo there. What's interesting about the bonobo is the bonobo was not only an out-of-group test of a separate species, but it was also outside the age range of the sample of chimpanzees. It was a how old was the bonobo, Gabriel? 3 or 6 years old, around that age?
About there, yeah.
Yeah, it was a younger individual, but it performed quite well. And then we tried it on a human skull, and it performed just poorly, extremely poorly. So then what we do is we take Mrs. Pless and we measure her craniometrics, and we see how they fit in the sample that was used to produce the equations. And Mrs. Pless was actually more different craniometrically to, Mrs. Pless was less different than the bonobo was in terms of her craniometrics. So the bonobo was we took all the measurements, it was very, very different. Mrs. Pless was less different, I guess. Does that explain that clearly?
Yeah. Yes. I think
so. Then obviously it's like, okay, that's sort of how we're deciding the suitability of the regressions to be used on STS5. And then obviously you can see that this is the final result. So for me, like I said, it's incomplete, but that can either be seen as, oh, well, you didn't get very far, or sweet, let's keep working and let's see how far we can take this.
Right,
and
like
I'm
this
not
new
ready
nose
to.
paper.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Like this new nose paper, what it does is now it adds another point to improve that. So basically, that we think of that as the canvas, this foundation that is actually, it's built solid. It's like a solid foundation to develop new methods of predictions. Because if you take the forensic literature for humans, people have been studying humans, at least more rigorously, for crime applications and things like that, more closely, and you would assume that, yeah, like these things work to some degree, but there's no objective measure by which those same methods could then be applied to an ancient Australopith.
That's right.
So what we need to do is, on top of this foundation, either emulate the Manchester method or any of these other width methods that have been established for humans, and then see if they work for chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and ourselves. We found that this one point, this works across all species, which is great, huge victory. That's going to improve that model that Ryan was just holding. So we just have to keep publishing new research that adds these markers to continue to improve what Pless may have looked like.
Yeah, because you can't take soft tissue measurements of a human and then extrapolate that to STS5. Why would you do that? I mean, I'm not. Let's say, like, let's just go into it blind and say that we we don't know. But what's your justification? So, what's the justification for taking human averages and then applying them to an Australopithecus? And it's like, well, there isn't one. It's like, oh, that seems like a bit of a problem. So that sort of, and I will, again, I just want to, I guess, bring up what I mentioned at the beginning, and that was, we're trying to address, the question that was, or the criticism that was raised by the Creation Museum. That's just one example, but their criticisms are pretty accurate. Just in that regard. I'm not saying overall anything else, but just in that regard, just in this very one thing, we need to have an answer for that, and we do. This is not a chimpanzee. This is not a bonobo. This is not just some monkey or another gorilla. This is something new, something different. Yeah. So.
And on top of that foundation, we may, because we want our research to grow and for people to have this in their homes or their collections or support the work. What we've continued to do is, using comparative anatomy and these other tools that are currently something that we're after to make sure that those things get published, we will go on to continue to refine, but then always with the caveat that our either consumers or supporters know that this is subject to high revision. So even if we create a model for this, and then let's say that this goes into a museum display, we will probably insist, actually surely insist, that the museum properly have its text and whatnot that says that this is a current model that's subject to revision, and that subjectivity to revision is something that should be celebrated. So even if it looks very much finished, I think we owe it to the public to not condescend and to say that, hold on, we're working on it, and it's almost like your vision on your glasses, right? Where right now I can still see, but I see a blurry face, right? That maybe right now we can only see that blurry face. And as we produce more studies, more regression analysis, more publications that justify more specificity, our eyesight into the past, this fog of time that we're battling, that will become ever more clear. Now, will ever be 20/20 vision? We don't know. But if we just throw up our hands and say, what's the point? Then the science will never improve.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to say was, very early on, we thought of coming up with like some sort of metric, one number that we could, systematically produce to sort of and assign that to a reconstruction. So, we sort of struggled and went back and forth how we could do that, but it's certainly something that we could develop. And that number, I guess, would sort of inform, it's like a biological accuracy. What's that like?
So it's like a confidence interval.
Yeah, like a confidence thing, like confidence in how real it is. So that's something we could certainly do. Yeah.
So what this makes me wonder is, like Gabriel mentioned, we don't know, or we may never have 20/20 vision on this. So at what point do you, of course you're not giving up, but at what point do you decide this is as accurate as we're going to get? Or is there not a point and you just keep going and going?
I suppose even if we never get to that level of, sorry about that, Ryan. I'll give the floor in a second. But if we never get there, we might still take it the rest of the way. Like we'll have soon a paper that may predict skin color. There might be some variability there, where at least it gives us like the minimum, like in terms of concentration of melanin. And that'll add some range, because obviously if you stand outside for a little while, you're going to get a little darker. So there's still a bit of freedom there. And then the hair, that's going to have a little bit of subjectivity. It's not going to stop us from going the rest of the way, but we do feel like we always have to say that there might be a better way to get slightly closer, even if we only get to 99.5%. We might get to 99.6, but at the very least, it's almost like with 99% of your vision, you can get to your car and probably drive somewhere successfully. So that's what we're trying to do, where maybe what we've viewed people doing in the past is just, going in almost blind, or with hunches that are maybe 20 to 30% of this confidence of sight, right? And we feel like maybe that's an irresponsible way to drive the car, if that analogy holds. And Ryan, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I just brought up a point about the hair. It's like, well, what do we know about the hair? Would they have hair in their mouth? Would they have hair on their salivary glands? And would they have hair on their hands? Would they have hair on the bottom of their feet? There are things that we do know. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to bring up that, like, the hair, it is easily one of the hardest things to do. But there's still quite a bit that we can find out and we can know. And then as to how far we take this, it's kind of a personal thing as to like whether or not you think it matters that we should be producing scientifically accurate approximations of Pio-Pleistocene hominids. For me and Gabriel, it absolutely matters, and it matters for all of the reasons that are important in science, and producing knowledge, new knowledge that is as objective as it possibly can be. It's no different than that. So for us, the next step is, I guess, you do the thing that's going to make the most difference first. So for us, that was the soft tissue. The integument overlying the skull. I'm not under I'm not under any illusions that Gabriel and I are going to solve every single problem on our own. you know, we want other people to be as enthusiastic about this as we are, and take over and use other methods, because, you know, there are other people who have different ideas, who have other ways of you know, recently I was speaking with a colleague who produced a similar paper, and there are very few of us who are interested in this. We want more people to be interested and care about this as seriously, and take it as seriously as we do, through the lens of a hard science perspective.
Right.
I guess I have to reiterate that, you know, like, what me and Gabriel are trying to do is hard science. It's not just intuition and a 3D artistic model. If you want to do that, fine. It's not what we're doing. It's not what we're about.
Right. It's almost like it's not that we're trying to disparage a certain way that it's been done. It's just, it's no secret, especially since we found this out, that it can be quite limiting artistically. So if you have an artist that's commissioned to do a full display of human evolution for a museum, getting to these roadblocks of justifying things scientifically can be stifling. Like, we've been doing this for 7 years, and we can only say that what Ryan was just holding up, this is what, like, we feel great about this. And it's like, we're so excited, this is like our baby, but then it's almost like seeing a baby picture from someone, it's like, you say it's cute, but it's like, you don't really care about that baby as much as they do. And you'll never, you know, so it's just very clear that, like, why this has fallen into the hands of artists, not very unlike me, because it's not like I have a degree in biology or anthropology or anything like that. But it's just very clear that it can be very stifling, a lot of roadblocks. If at any moment you want to put some clay down, you have to stop for a second and be like, hey, is this justified? It would take this long, and then you would never have a display. So what I've started to do is try to think of, like, okay, how can we do a museum display where these things are taken into account? And that's kind of what my thesis ended up being, where it was an exploration of how do you show the science in a responsible way, and how that might map onto museums, and that'll be my my hobby horse for the next year, as well as continuing the research with Ryan.
So would you guys say at this point that there's a very strong difference between paleo art and paleo reconstruction? And is what you guys do more reconstruction, or is there not really a difference?
I'd say that what we have produced in our publications is, I guess me and Gabriel have spoken about it before, because it goes to, like, what is art, you know, like, art is
that's
sort
true.
of, like,
Yeah,
general
that's true.
term.
Even so Ryan and I have disagreement on what art is, because I mean, if I'm going to an art school for art, like, art has a very different connotation amongst art academics, where it's really just philosophers talking, you know, past each other almost, where it's like not really helpful. So it's like, yeah, like numinous terms like that, like, yeah, just go ahead, Ryan, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, Gabriel is as much as an investigator as I am, even though I'm obviously, you know, doing a lot of writing and measuring and statistics and whatnot. We are equally investigating this, and we bounce off each other, you know, even though we're from two totally different worlds with two totally different backgrounds in our educations. He's as much as a scientist as I am, but we both have our skills. So Gabriel has these, I guess, how would I describe it? Amazing, like, hand coordination. He's able to manipulate clay in a way that I never will be. Lots of publications by scientists that include reconstructions are very lackluster. The figures are not good, because scientists like myself, I am not an artist. I am not a sculptor. I may dabble in it a little bit, but I am not a sculptor. That's where Gabriel, that's where he shines. That's why art, and I guess, again, we're using that word again, because I see him more as a scientist than an artist. So, you know, that's why these sort of collaborations, it's like we're equal, we're working towards the same goal, we're both investigators, but we're just using the best of each other's skills and abilities that we've developed over time.
That's actually a very interesting thing, if I may, really quick, Seth, that sometimes when I'm sharing my work with maybe my committee members at my former MFA, I may say now, but like when I'm talking to artists, right, often I do hear, like, so where's the art in this? As in, like, what you're doing is very pragmatic. It's very for a purpose, that the art community has kind of like left the building on that mission. they're on some other thing, which is fine, it's great. That I do think that because we are very didactic almost, like what we want to do is to shed light on something new, that yeah, sometimes that's an interesting world to operate in. But honestly, Ryan and I talk just like this like free form conversation about any particular topic. Sometimes 3-4 hours a day, sometimes a week, every day. Sometimes we have weeks where we're like, we kind of like, it's almost like we've understood each other. Like when we're not bothering each other very much, it's like, maybe it's time to just chill for a second. And then next week we'll go into these 3-hour Skype calls or messenger calls all day, and to really hash this out. And sometimes Ryan will have a sculptural idea for like an artistic idea, and it'll surprise me. And I know that there's been times where, even though, yeah, Ryan and Machi, our mentor, Ryan is doing a lot of the scientific heavy lifting, but then sometimes the practice of reconstructing, sometimes I can come to Ryan and say, hey, these points are great, but if we want to do the head,
yeah, that's
we need to investigate over here, because sculpturally I need to be able to justify that. And then the very fact that I need scientific justification for something that I know that I'm going to need, I know that in our meetings I have to say like, hey, like we need this, or like the nose, we actually figured out the length of the nose. That was great. It was really exciting. But then I was like, okay, that's awesome, but we also need the angle, because I need to know where to put this. Yeah, and that was like a sculptural idea that kind of infected the science, where otherwise that. Go ahead, Ryan.
I just all of those conversations that we have, it's a back and forth, a bit of resistance from maybe either side or whatever, but it just makes it better. Like it makes the publication better. I mean, one of the examples I mentioned, that it took me 3 months to measure all the soft tissue landmarks and do the regressions, and I'm writing the methods, and I'm writing the conclusion and whatnot. But then Gabriel's like, I think we need a few more points. It's like
I have to walk that tightrope where it's like, I know that it's going to be an annoying ask. Yeah. And it actually did happen where Ryan was also gracious that like we did at the last moment add a few more, and then lo and behold, Ryan and Machi found, because the statistics heavy work they do. I'm pretty good at math, but not that. I mean, I have a proclivity for math, but they're on some other level there where they did find that, and it was great. It was like, it's almost like it vindicates not me, because I'm not really boastful in that way, but just like the act of collaborating, these two almost what you would call, I wouldn't call them opposite, but they're definitely on some sort of opposite sides of the spectrum, where art is free flowing and poetic and subjective, and then science is considered, hard, stern, rule based, empirical. Yeah. But where these things we've found that at least the way that we do it is a healthy way that it can blend.
Yeah, so it's not like that, you either got a scientific reconstruction or you got an artistic reconstruction. It's like you can do both. You can sort of put the two together, and there's a compromise on neither side. The science doesn't become any less scientific, the art doesn't become any less artistic. And that everything that Gabriel and I have described, the whole process, the back and forth exchanges, that should just inspire people to like continue with our approach. It's a lot of fun. It's exciting. We've had a lot of good moments, and I guess so rewarding. Like I said, like this little model here. Yeah.
And it's interesting that sense, like that one almost pragmatic need of mine, like as a practitioner, that I needed an angle or I needed more points, right? That it worms its way into the science, but also the humility of, or at least the celebration of what Ryan was just showing, that the level of what we know, and then that we can stop there, has also influenced the way that I artistically show my sculptures, or rather I should say our sculptures, pardon me. But in my thesis exhibition, how I showed these reconstructions, even though the Tong child looks very, finished, he's got pores and wrinkles and all that, I still showed them behind frosted glass where they appeared blurred. It wasn't important for me for people to see all the painstaking details, because we can't justify that yet. So it's almost like the science was giving me a very strong, at least my thesis committee thought so, a very strong conceptual language conceptual meaning like artistically, where the very your use of materials, you know, kind of tell the story, where this pane of glass that's in front obscuring your view, it shows, it illustrates, if for lack of a better word, that we're at a point in time where it's exciting what we can see, but we're still obscured. So it's interesting how the science is also, you know, wormed its way. So it's a very healthy back and forth.
Yeah, it's so integrated. I don't think you can really say that it's art or science. It's a combination, a healthy combination of the two.
Which is what I think, you know, most sciences should be. If they're not, they should be interdisciplinary. But and I'm so glad to see that you guys are doing that and mixing these two, like you said, what seem like opposite fields together to make something that is truly beautiful. And I'd like to wrap this up with one final question that kind of relates to what I just said, and that's, what importance do you think having these models, having this visualization of these creatures does for the field at large? Like, I understand how important it could be to see that and the feelings and the thoughts that inspires, but scientifically and going forward, like what do you think it provides?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, yeah, one thing to be like, oh, look, that's a nice model. That's all well and good. But think about it. If you can accurately reconstruct the masticatory muscles of Paranthropus boisei, you can extract from that the biting performance. They already do it, but you could use that method and then test what has been done and see how it compares. And again, it goes back to, we're trying to tell the story of the past, and we're trying to do that as accurately as possible. Why should visual depictions of Pio-Pleistocene hominids be any different? I guess that's really my take on it. It's like a two-parter: creating a better, more accurate depiction of the past, and also new methods that can be used in other studies that have nothing to do with facial approximation. May I pass on to Gabriel?
Yeah, and just to add to that point before I go into mine, that in this new study that is under preprint with the nose, a lot of the content of the discussion and the conclusion was about biology, so actual morphology of primates, where right. our mission to just get a point on our sculptures, right, to get that point accurate, has also, at least in part, revealed something about the morphology of all primates, or at least this section of primates, which is exciting. That means that when we're after our very narrow thing, that what we want is accurate models that, you know, share human evolution with the public, we're also, in a sense, contributing to biological anthropology.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, like, what about you know, people who say, oh, we're not related to chimpanzees? That's nonsense. They're animals. We're something different. Right. But our equations, the fact that they work on humans, chimpanzees, and then gorillas, and then less so on orangutans, and then less so on Papio-homodryas, the baboons, it just, you're validating what has already been demonstrated genetically in genetics. You know, that like we are closer, these species are closer to humans than these species are. So it's totally separate, but it's all the same topic.
And then to answer the other section of your question, or at least how I understood it, was that there is this pragmatic contribution to the science, which I think is obvious. But I do think that it echoed a question that I was asked this past few weeks, where what does it mean? Because I expressed that like the ever receding goalpost, where we might not ever get to 100% accuracy or confidence, right? So why bother, right? And I thought of that image of the Earthrise from the moon, where a lot of people say, like, what is the moon landing for? Like, why are we investing? And then, like, what that has done, that image of us rising from another celestial body, that image has inspired countless children, kids, adults into astrophysics or just science in general, and infected them with, you know, the science bug. When you catch it, you know. I mean, I'm sure both of you caught it at some point, right? And those images that have a way of stirring our imagination and then taking hold of it, and then it's kind of changing your trajectory, where when you can when you tell someone like, oh, this is Lucy, or like this is the great grandmother of humanity, or this is Homo erectus, we come from there, right? But when you can say with confidence that there are methods behind it that make it more real, where if you have a picture of your great thousand greats grandmother, that kind of unites us, the mitochondrial Eve, let's say, right? That could have a way of having a similar effect, where if you really see that you contend with this person almost in a museum setting per se, or just an image, it could just be a two-dimensional image. It could have a way of stirring excitement about science that then gets more people involved, where it doesn't have to be about doing work for reconstructions, but it could be, cancer research, it could be, diabetes research, it could be all sorts of other, vaccine research, anything that's more, I guess, pragmatic, but it just more people in STEM, I think I don't think it would be a bad thing.
Yeah, two other things I would add was like Gabriel mentioned at the beginning how much he had learned like just doing this. So it's like, education should be fun.
Yeah.
People like to play with clay, people like to make models, so people like 3D printing. What we do encapsulates all of that. And while you're doing that, you're learning things and you have no idea that you're learning it because it's so organic, I guess that's one way. So as a way of taking what we do and then implementing that into education, I can just see that as just perfect for teaching, comparative anatomy. So there's that. But then the other thing I thought was, what we provide will kind of tidy up the sort of depictions. And I mean, recently I've been seeing, because Australopithecus sediba, new fossil remains, been seeing lots of reconstructions of sediba and of the same individual, the same specimen. And they're totally different. You got one that looks like it's European with very lightly pigmented skin, and then one that's very darkly pigmented. So to someone who doesn't know what MH1 Australopithecus sediba is, it's like, oh, well, these are 3-4 different, animals that existed in the past. What we do just sort of tidies that up. It's like, no, this is the sediba. We should be working towards a definitive version of each of these specimens. There is not 1,000 different ways that you can reconstruct Mrs. Pless. She only looked one way, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
And that, I think, is absolutely just something we can all look forward to seeing as you guys develop it further. I know I'm excited because, to me, even though it, of course, doesn't compare to a full sculpture in front of you, even just, I mean, I have, 3D prints of craniums, etc., and just looking into the orbits, and I can imagine looking into the actual sculpted eyes of the Tong child, etc., just ignites something in us that, as was mentioned, just drives you in. And we do need more people in STEM, and we do need more people who are interested. And I think this is a very exciting, fun, and new way to experience something that unites all of us. And I really wanted to thank you guys for sharing all that. I think you have been amazing and your work is amazing, and I really look forward to seeing it. Is there anything else you guys would like to share with us?
Yeah, well, you can find our work at pithecus.org, like you said earlier. We will be developing that website in the next few months into a resource where it won't just be images of reconstructions, but it'll be where people could either see our papers. We'll be posting data, rotational models, so that people that can't have physical objects that we're all privileged to have, but as long as they have a stable internet connection, they could virtually view these fossils, and I think that would be a great resource. So we're going to develop that, and you can find my progress, or rather our progress, on my Instagram, which you just search my name. It's my name with art at the end, so Gabriel Venus art, and then you'll be able to see these reconstructions kind of slowly come to life. I post progress videos, so if you're interested in reconstructions, I regularly post there.
That's awesome. All right, guys. Well, I just want to thank you so much again for coming on, and it's been awesome.
Thank you for adventuring with us into the human past. If you've enjoyed this video, check out our website at www.cranial.com worldofpaleoanthropology.org, and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.